Move on to chapter 5, page 58. Now, in this chapter, we're going to find directions for step 4 and step 5. Never knew that. I read through this book before and went to book studies, but they were actually book readings. I always thought there is no order to this book whatsoever. It just never seemed like it. But in studying, I found this is actually in great order. Steps 4 and 5 are what we're going to find here, and we'll point it out as we get there. So how it works, and again, this is what is these first 2.5 pages, basically, are what is read at most AA meetings in the beginning. Somebody says, will somebody read how it works, right? Somebody has a laminated form of these 2.5 pages that gets read. And while it gets read at most meetings, this is what I find incredible. You can be going to meetings again for years and years and years. And I've heard that read so many times, like myself, that I can recite those first 2.5 pages, and I never tried to memorize them. I just heard it so many times since I was a teenager. I could just do it. You just hear it. Think about it. You hear a song, how many times will it take until you can recite? You didn't try to memorize the whole thing. It just happens, right? This just became a working part of my mind. But you know what I found? I sat down with a mentor. I'm like, well, we can skip through that. I know that. God, I can recite it. But we ain't here to read, and we ain't here to recite. We're going to be here to study. I'm thinking, okay, you're going to tell me something in here that I don't know. And actually, I found right in the first sentence, that's something I didn't know. There's a whole lot in here I didn't know. You're going to see the big difference between reading it and studying it. Starts out saying, rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. And we're going to cover that sentence in some detail here right now. First off, let's qualify what they're talking about. Rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. Let's take the first part of that. My question would be, if I was a new person, rarely have we seen a person fail to what? Doesn't say. Rarely have we seen a person fail to get sober? Or is it rarely have we seen a person fail to recover? Well, the way we know the answer to that is we read the next sentence. Those who do not recover. Oh, okay. So we're talking about those who recover. Rarely does anyone not recover. If they do what? Thoroughly follow our path, the author's path. Authors are more than 100 men and women. We read that in the beginning. What is their path? Path is in clear-cut detail in the first portion of this book. If you do these clear-cut directions directly from the book and nothing else, it will be rare for you to fail. I think we talked about this on our Tuesday night meeting last week, that I've mentioned this many times here as well. We'll get into forward to second edition. You know, when we start talking about the percentages of recovery, talked about this several times. Talks about the forward to second edition, how before they wrote that second edition and published it in 1955, that was 16 years after the first edition. 16 years after this was written, they did the second edition. They did a little survey. And by count, it shows that at minimum, 75% of people, it says, who came to AA and really tried, recovered. And then I always like going into asking, well, we know that during that time in the second edition, this is what they were studying at all the meetings. And that's the only thing that I know different in AA meetings than in today. I mean, the people, alcohol is the same, alcoholics are the same. Nothing's changed in any of that. The only thing that I know that's changed is that we don't see this book out nearly as much as they did back then. What's the result? Well, back then they had a 75% recovery rate. What do we have today? I don't know. AA doesn't tell us, and I'm not going to give you my opinion, but we have talked about it before. And I think the general consensus amongst people who have been around a little while is it ain't anywhere near 75%. That sound correct? Does anybody think that that's incorrect? Anybody think we got around the 75% rate? Anybody think we have more than 10%? Yeah. Maybe. Okay. 50? We see 50%? No. Huh. So why is our rate so low compared to back then? At least 50% lower. Again, the only thing I know different is we got the book out now. And the book gives us clear-cut directions on how to recover. So we talk about that. I've talked about this several times. That sounds great, 75% recovery rate, doesn't it? That's what we're trying to showcase here. Recovery rate. But you know what I started thinking about? last week, I've thought about this ever before, but last week I thought about this. I started thinking about that. I started thinking about the second edition. I started thinking they had a 75% recovery rate. Is 75% considered rare? It's, I don't know the definition of a percentage for rare, but 75% seems like a majority, but that doesn't sound like rare. It's like you go to the doctor, it'll be rare for you not to recover from this. 75%. That's not rare, right? That's not what I count as rare. It would have to be a lot higher than that, I would think, to be rare. So why are we getting two contradicting things? Well, we do know when this book was written, again, there were just a little over 100 men and women who wrote it. We do know at that time there were three groups. There were only three meetings: New York, Akron, Ohio, and Cleveland. Those were the three meetings. And everybody who went to those meetings were within the first 100 that wrote this book. They all knew this book. They all had a hand in authoring the book, right? So what happened in 1939 when they wrote it? They shipped this book all over the country. And then you have a guy in New Mexico, he's got an alcohol problem, and he's got this book, and he's reading it. Remember, he can't study it if he doesn't have somebody elaborating and explaining what's in here. But he's getting the gist. At least he's got the freaking book, right? So he's getting the gist, and he knows, and maybe he recovers. And then what does he do? He does what they did: start going to hospitals and try finding people who are sick. And some of them start recovering. And once he gets a little group of them, then what? Then he's got a meeting he can form. Now, it might not look exactly like the meetings that they had in Akron and Cleveland and New York, because he didn't have a hand in author. He might not have mastered this in detail. But what that indicates is somewhat, by 1955, it may have got watered down a little bit. So even though we think a 75% recovery rate in 1955 is great, that's a bit watered down to when it was rare with the first three groups. So if we have the absolute directions and we're studying exactly what these guys did in 1939, and we're working with people and we're explaining exactly, like we're doing here today, exactly what's in here with new people, you shouldn't have a 75% recovery rate with new people. It should be rare for them to not recover. It should be a rarity. And the insane thing about that is I can't tell you how many meetings I went to. We're going to have a first step meeting because old John went out and drank again after being sober 6 months. So John's here and he just relapsed. And what's the first thing we tell him? John, it's normal. It happens. Rare. That's not normal. That's rare. Why didn't it work for John? Well, they said the only way that it'll be rare is if you thoroughly follow the path. John, did anybody show you the path? I think that's the first thing that I've seen, is that the path was never shown for him to even have a chance to thoroughly follow it, right? If you're given the path like we're doing here and you choose not to follow it, then that's on you. But it's incumbent upon us that have recovered to show these people what the path is. That's our job, so that it can be rare for them not to recover. Does that make sense? It's kind of how it hit me. A lot in that first sentence. So next sentence, those who do not recover. So who doesn't recover? It says it's rare for them not to recover, but who are those who do not recover? Those people who cannot, or people who will not completely give themselves to the simple program. Two classifications of people who do not recover. And I love it. If you end up recovering, or if you are recovered and you go to a meeting and you introduce yourself, oh, you're well, you're then you just can simply look back and say, so you are saying that you are not recovered and you've been sober 18 years and you're not recovered? Well, are you a cannot or a will not? Because it says here, that's the only people who don't recover. Is it because you're a cannot or a will not? Right? The rest of this paragraph is going to talk about the cannots. Because what does it mean that you cannot thoroughly follow this path? You're going to talk about that. They don't explain anything about the will not, because I think we can kind of gather what that means. I'm going to show you the path. If you will not do it, we get it. You're just not going to do it. And actually, there's two types of will nots. No, I'm sorry, there's two types of cannots. The will not's very simple. You just won't do it. I'll show you our solution. If you're not interested, that's fine. We don't need to explain that, right? You just won't do it. There's many of those. There's probably the majority, in my experience, the majority of people that I've worked with that have failed to, that I've worked with directly, that have failed to recover, are people who will not do this work. They just won't do it for whatever reason. Haven't been beaten to a state of reasonableness yet, I guess, but for whatever reason. That's the majority. But let's talk about the cannots. So who are the cannots? So the cannots are people who cannot give themselves to the civil, completely give themselves to the civil program. Usually men and women who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. That's a cannot. A person who is constitutionally incapable. That means within their makeup, they just can't, even if they wanted to. Can't what? Can't be honest. That's the only qualification they're making here. Can you be honest? There are some people who can't be honest with themselves, even if they wanted to. Can't. There are such unfortunates, and they're not at fault. They seem to have been born that way. That's not somebody who's lying. Somebody just simply can't. I haven't met one yet. I'm not saying they're not out there. I'm sure they are, but I haven't encountered one that has not been able to be honest. It says they're naturally incapable of grasping and developing a manner of living which demands, that sounds like a must, demands what? Rigorous honesty. What kind of honesty? Now we're talking about honesty again, but we're talking about rigorous. Rigorous means the full measure of honesty, by definition, the full measure of honesty. We're offering a manner of living. You are going to live a new life that demands rigorous honesty. Either you won't do it, or are you one that can't do it? Their chances are less than average. Average is 50-50. Their chances are less than that. There are those too who suffer from grave emotional and mental disorders. That means that there are people out there, grave emotional, we don't need to look up grave. That means people who are really messed up in their head, gravely jacked up. And it says, but even many of them even recover. They have one thing, the capacity to be honest. You can think that guy is psychotic. He's talking to the wall. There's no, if he has a capacity to be honest, he has the capacity to recover. That's what they're telling us here. Not a lot of those cannots. It's a whole lot more will-nots. But there is one other cannot that they don't mention here, because I don't think they ever saw it coming. I don't think, and we talked about it already. I don't think they ever saw this coming. They told us in Forward to Second Edition that when this book was launched, when they wrote this book, they said the flying blind period ended in AA. We're not trying all sorts of different things anymore. This works. Flying blind is over. This is what we're teaching. And we're going to put it in a book so that you don't repeat it to him, and he repeats it to him, and he repeats it to him. And by the time 5 years goes by, it's nothing what it originally looked like. That's why they put it in writing. This is what works. Flying blind is over. The only way that you can go back into that flying blind period is to start having AA meetings without pulling this book out and teaching it. What percentage of meetings do you go to that they pull this book out? Study it. Is it 75% of meetings? Okay. Is it 10% of meetings? It's pretty rare. Flying blind period. If you're in a flying blind period, you can't teach this if you haven't learned it. And if you can't teach this to a newcomer, it's not going to be rare for them to not recover. It's going to be the opposite of that, which is common. It's going to be quite common. And they even seem to accept that at some meetings. Oh, it's very common for you to not, that you went out. That happens all the time. And we're going to accept that as normal. That is not normal. That is not normal. We hide this book. You're not going to have it rare for people to recover. It's that simple. That's simple. Does that make sense? That's just the first paragraph. Anybody ever get that out of when you go to a meeting and they read? How many people have been to meetings where they read how it works at the beginning? At least in Michigan, we read it at almost actually at every meeting, we always read it. So you guys have heard this plenty of times. Did you ever get that out of that first paragraph? I never did. And again, I got a guy with 18 years sitting at a table saying, oh, you're recovered? How's that? Oh my God, how many times have you heard this read? Where it says rare, it'd be rare for you not to recover. How many times have you heard it? You could probably recite it to me. but you don't even know what you're reciting. Think about it. Big difference between a book reading and a book study. Very, very different. All right, let's move on a little further. Our stories disclose in a general way what we used to be like and what happened and what we are like now. We are no longer talking about alcohol, as the beginning of the last chapter I mentioned. And what were we just talking about just a couple of moments ago in chapter 4 about problems with personal relationships, a self-imposed crisis? We ain't talking about alcohol. We're talking about our problems, right? We talked about a self-imposed crisis, self. What we're talking about here is our stories disclosed in a general way. And I always thought, I remember giving open talks when I was a teenager. You get them for a bunch of people, talk. And I give it, okay, so I'm supposed to be here to tell you guys what it used to be like, what happened, and what it's like now. That is not what that says. And then I would get up there and do what most everybody does who gives an open talk. I'm going to tell you what it used to be like. I'm going to tell you about all the trouble I got into, how much I was drinking, what it used to be like. It doesn't say that. This is what I used to be like. This was a self-imposed. What was I like? And then what happened? What did I do? And what am I like now? That's how our stories disclose. That's how they're supposed to be disclosed, anyways, according to this book. And what we are like now. So we're beginning step 4, right? No, I'm sorry, step 3. Yeah, this is step 3. I'm sorry. I may have said 4 and 5. This covers step 3 and 4, this chapter, not 4 and 5, it's 3 and 4. So it says here, if you have decided you want what we have and are willing to go to any lengths to get it, then you're ready to take certain steps. That's a big statement. It's not a big qualification when you're somebody that you're working with gets to this point. They got this conception of God. Hopefully they've been beat up enough that they realize their life's unmanageable and that they can't straighten it out themselves. If they've gotten to that point, then it says, in order for you to be able to be ready to take any further steps, any further action, you have to have 2 qualifications at this point. And one is that you want what we have. You want what we have? You want to become recovered. And then the second qualification, that one's pretty easy, especially for new people coming in because they got a lot of heat on them. Yes, I want what you have. I don't want all the trouble I have, right? I want what you have. But here's the next question is, are you willing to do anything to get it? Because we're talking about a whole new way of living. And it has nothing to do with just not drinking or being sober. Small part of it. Are you willing to do anything? That's the qualification. If you're not ready to take certain steps. You can stop right there with the new person. It's that simple. Either go back and reread what we've read, or he may have to go out and get convinced a little more. But it tells us right here, you cannot go on if you're not convinced of that. It says that some of these certain steps we balked. We thought we could find an easier, softer way. And boy, is there some easier, softer ways. Me and Adam was talking about this morning about it at a lot of other meetings. Look, man, you ain't got to do all that work and all that stuff they're talking about, studying and all that crap. All you really need to do is just keep going to meetings and stick around the winners, right? And somehow this is just going to rub off on you, right? Just stick around and just keep going to a lot of meetings. That's an easier, softer way. And it says many of them tried those easier, softer ways. They thought they could find it, but they couldn't. It says, with all the earnestness at our command, we beg of you. We're going to see that word only a few times in this book. So they're giving us clear-cut directions, but pay attention to the wording. We're begging you, please, we beg of you to be fearless and thorough from the very start. Do this. Do not look for the easier, softer way. It is a road to misery if you're an alcoholic. They're begging us. Some of us have tried to hold onto our old ideas, and the result was nil. It means they got nothing until they let go. Absolutely. Let go of all of it. Ideas, emotions, and attitudes. Cast to one side. Remember that we deal with alcohol, cunning, baffling, powerful. Without help, it is too much for us. But there is one who has all power. That one is God. May you find him now. That's why we got step 2. That's why we just did step 2. It's too much for us. We're powerless. But there is one who has all power. That one is God. May you find him now. What did half measures do for us? Did half measures avail us half success? Does half measures avail us nothing? 0. So we stood at the turning point. And we asked this protection and care with complete abandon. Complete abandon. We're looking at as abandoning ourselves because we have a self-imposed crisis. Abandon myself. Asking his protection and care. That means it's no longer for me to provide my protection and care. I have done a lousy job of it. So here are the steps we took, which are suggested in the program of recovery. I don't need to read them to you because that's all I can do, because there's no directions there for me to explain. They're simply cliff notes. So we're just going to skip right past that and go right to page 60 in the next paragraph. It says, many of us exclaimed, what an order. I can't go through with it. Do not be discouraged. No one among us has been able to maintain anything like perfect adherence to these principles. Note that they're calling these steps principles. Will come up later. We are not saints. The point is that we are willing to grow along spiritual lines. We read earlier that our recovery depends on our maintenance and growth of our spiritual experience. In other words, when we have the spiritual experience, like the guy we read at the end of chapter 4, once he had it, it will go away if we do not maintain and grow it. So it sounds like some things we're going to need to do, right? We're willing to grow along spiritual lines. The principles we have set down are guides to progress. We claim spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. All right, so they're going to summarize, getting us to step 3 here. Our description of the alcoholic. Where did we get the description of the alcoholic? Doctor's opinion, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. That was their description of the alcoholic. And then the chapter to the agnostic. Well, that was chapter 4. So they said everything you've read up to this point and our personal adventures before and after, that would be the case studies we've read within those chapters. They've made clear 3 pertinent ideas. So we have an A, B, and C here. And these things at this point, before you start step 3, are going to be the pre-qualifications for step 3. Are you convinced of these things? That's the question. Are you convinced that you are alcoholic and cannot manage your own life? That's question 1. Question 2 is, are you convinced that probably no human power could have relieved your alcoholism? Are you convinced of that? And the last thing is, are you convinced that God could and that he would if he were sought? How do I know that's talking about step 3? What does the next sentence say? Being convinced we're at step 3. Oh, how did we get convinced? From A, B, and C. Now, as I understand it, I haven't seen this for myself, but as I understand it, the manuscript form before this got released, when Bill had written this, right after C, it did not say being convinced we're at step 3. It said something along the lines, and it was pretty harsh, and it got changed. I'm going to have to paraphrase it, but I don't think I'm far off the mark when he said, at this point, if you are not convinced, then you either need to reread this book from the beginning or throw it in the trash can. That's how convinced he was. So it's a very important qualification for this A, B, and C. I say that it's not just for new people to understand that, but also for those of you that are working with other people. They're not convinced. You ask these questions when you get to this point of your work. How do we work with a new guy? We're going to show them our discovery. First portion, we're going to do exactly what we're doing here today. We're going to sit down one-on-one, and we're going to study this all the way through here. And when we come to a direction, we're going to do it. When you come to this point, here's a direction. Ask those questions. Are you convinced of those 3 things? If you are, we can move forward. If not, then we won't. I'm just going to finish this last paragraph. Being convinced we're at step 3, which is that we made a decision to turn our will and our life over to the care of God as we understood him. Just what do we mean by that? And just what do we do? But where's the action in making this decision? Again, read step 3. See any action there? Where's the directions? They're going to give us the directions next, and that's what we're going to cover next week. So with that, we are going to stop for the day.